I couldn't have imagined China would be like this today. I mean, from that day when there were no cars on the road, no cars, not one, from Capital Airport to Beijing Fandian, not one car, and now we have this. How could I possibly have foreseen that? On April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, the expansion of our war in Vietnam into a greater area in Cambodia. The students, I was then a sophomore at Harvard College. Harvard, as did every university in the United States, erupted into protest. I go to a professor at Harvard and I say, I want to understand why good people, the American government, do bad things, the war in Vietnam. So I want to study Vietnamese. He was this big, august Harvard professor. He said, Steve, if you want to learn about Asia, if you want to learn about the war in Vietnam, you should study Chinese, not Vietnamese. So that was kind of my original connection to China. It was actually through Vietnam, not because of an interest in China. So when I graduated Harvard Law School, I joined what's called the Legal Advisor's Office of the United States State Department. In the Waijiaobu, you call it the Tiaofasi, the Treaties and Law Department. And my first year there, I worked on political military affairs. That is how the United States interacts with the world. Its foreign policy is affected by the U.S. military. Then President Carter was elected, and they discovered there was a Chinese-speaking lawyer in the State Department, and I was moved from political military affairs to East Asian and Pacific affairs. So it was called the Assistant Legal Advisor's Office for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. And my then boss, a book came out about my former boss yesterday, Richard Holbrooke. He was a famous diplomat. At that point, he wasn't so famous. He was an assistant secretary of state. And he says, do you really speak Chinese? I said, yes. He said, do you really read Chinese? I said, yes. I said, I translated a book called Guoji Gongfa into English from Chinese. So that's good enough. So I got moved into this. The reason they moved me was that President Carter had decided that, President Nixon had only half completed the job, that we had established liaison offices, but we hadn't established full diplomatic relations with China, and we needed to do that. So he created this very small working group to work on the establishment of diplomatic relations. What I always say about that working group, it had a lot of chiefs and one Indian. I was the Indian, so I was the worker bee. Everybody else was 领导，其他的人都是领导，就有一个小土豆。So I get to, so a lot of the legal aspects of the establishment of diplomatic relations, I then was responsible to. So a lot of the drafting I would do and would go up to the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and then to the President. So it was the legal aspects of the establishment of diplomatic relations that I worked on. And then I still remember, after we established diplomatic relations, it's funny, I didn't know that would be the most important thing I ever did in my life. I was 28 years old. This organization, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, helped shape the perception of China by hosting the Chinese ping pong team and doing all these other things. It was viewed as very poor, very backward. A lot of people, you remember it snowed when Nixon visited China in 1972, and they were using brooms to sweep the snow away. And that was kind of the vision of America. That they didn't have snow plows, they just used brooms. It was quite something, but it wasn't a negative. It was just poor, backward, and communist. To fly to China then, I had to fly New York, Tokyo, Tokyo, Shanghai, Shanghai, Beijing. So it took 25 hours.
Wow.
So I arrived in Beijing and it was a little after midnight. So I left here the 18th. I arrived a little after midnight on the 19th. And it was Old Capitol Airport. And the bags, it was an old 707. The bags just got thrown on the ground and then put on the conveyor belt. It was amazing. Then the Jedi Danwei, you had to have a Jedi Danwei, so came to pick me up. And I rode from, again, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I rode from the Capitol Airport to the Beijing hotel, where I would live for the next 2 years. And we didn't pass one other car. Next morning, it's so noisy. It's like so noisy. And I go, what's all the noise? And we say, there must be a parade. So we open the curtains onto Chang'an-jie. Bicycle bells. Tens of thousands of bicycle bells. You couldn't cross the street because there were so many bicycles. Wow. It was amazing. Now they drive BMWs, they drive Mercedes, they travel the world. I've watched a miracle. Gaige Kaifang has changed the way Chinese people look, the way they dress. Chinese people are bigger than they were back then. They're healthier. They look healthier. So I've seen enormous changes that have been, by and large, positive. Educational levels are just phenomenal now. Back then, judges were retired military officers. They didn't necessarily know anything about law. Now the judges are highly educated. They've gone to the best law schools. They really are good. The whole judicial system, even though it's not perfect, is certainly an enormous improvement over what it was in 1979. So there have been wide array of changes. It was not predictable. I don't think Deng foresaw it. I don't think Deng Xiaoping knew that when he unleashed the private sector, when he created agricultural reform and allowed the private sector to begin to really produce. These farmers were allowed to have their own plots. I don't think he realized that this was the beginning of an amazing trajectory for the Chinese people. It's a combination that for many years it was good economic policy combined with Confucian values. So I always find, people always say, why do I have such, why do I share values with so many Chinese? Why do Chinese get along with me well? Why do I have so many friends who are Chinese? And I think in part that Confucianism and Judaism, I'm Jewish, and Judaism share a lot. So if a Chinese family can scrape together $100, or a Jewish family can scrape together $100, what do? They educate their children. That's just so fundamental. And it's why, in part, China has succeeded the way it has. One of the, because I was there in 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, one of the miracles was, Mao was a deeply flawed leader, but he did do some things which were good. One was he educated women, that he gave primary and secondary school education to women. So when Gaige Kaifang really got going, those women were able to move into the factories, which required education. You couldn't work in these factories if you were illiterate. So when I went to these factories in Shenzhen and in Shekou and in Zhuhai and later in Dongguan, they were all women. They were all educated women. And it's what allowed China to begin to grow. So it was partly Confucian value. So it was Confucian values combined with Mao making one of his good decisions.